3 separate times, men lowered the crown of China onto this one man's head. 3 separate times. They pried it back off. He was 2 years and 10 months old at the first coronation, screaming through the whole ceremony while his father held him still on the dragon throne and promised him it would soon be over. That was only the start. Over the next 60 years, he would be handed thrones, wives, titles, and whole countries, almost none of which he chose, and he would watch every single one of them taken away again. By the end, the most worshipped human being ever born in China was a nearsighted man in a plain cotton jacket, wandering the streets of Beijing, stopping strangers to ask for directions home. When they asked who he was, he told them the truth. He said he used to be the emperor of China. Nobody believed him. Why would they? Except it was true, and being the last emperor of China is, by a wide margin, the least unbelievable thing about him. This is the story of Asen Joro Puyi. 10 of the things he actually did sound invented. They aren't. Every one is documented, by his own tutor, by his memoir, by court records, by a war crimes tribunal, by the museum curators who guard the proof today. Let's count them down. Start with the dynasty, because you need it to feel the fall. The Qing was the last imperial dynasty of China, founded by the Manchus, outsiders from the cold northeast who seized Beijing in 1644 and ruled for nearly 3 centuries. At its height, it governed roughly a third of all the people alive on Earth. By the time our story opens, that empire was rotting from the inside, hollowed out by lost wars, humiliating treaties, and a court that had quietly forgotten how to govern. The person holding it together by sheer will was the Empress Dowager Cixi, who had dominated the throne for nearly 50 years. In November 1908, Cixi was dying. The reigning Guangxu emperor, whom she had imprisoned years earlier for trying to reform the country out from under her, died on the 14th, childless, 1 day before she did. Many historians believe he was poisoned. Modern forensic tests on his remains, published in 2008, found levels of arsenic thousands of times above normal, though exactly whose hand administered it is still argued over. On her last full day alive, Cixi named the next son of heaven. She chose a toddler. His name was Puyi, and he was 2 years and 10 months old. His father, Prince Chun, would govern as regent. Puyi himself would rule nothing, but he would be worshipped as if he ruled everything. That contradiction is the engine of his entire life. And consider what he was inheriting. By 1908, the Qing Empire was a giant on its knees. It had lost 2 opium wars to Britain, signed away ports and tariffs, and whole stretches of sovereignty in treaty after treaty, and been beaten badly by a fast modernizing Japan in 1895. The throne Puyi was being carried toward was not power. It was the wreckage of power. A sacred title balanced on an empire the modern world had already started carving up. A toddler was being made the figurehead of a ship that was visibly going down, and everyone in the hall except the toddler knew it. The world he was carried into was unlike any other on Earth. The Forbidden City was not a palace. It was a walled city inside a city, more than 70 hectares of courtyards, halls, and gates, designed so that almost no one alive was allowed to enter it. For 500 years, commoners who crossed its threshold uninvited could be executed. Inside lived the emperor, his women, and an army of eunuchs, men who had been castrated so they could serve in the one place no other men were permitted to go. It was a machine built to turn a single person into a deity and everyone around him into shadows. And into the heart of that machine, in the winter of 1908, they carried a screaming child. The records are blunt about the scene. On the evening of 13 November, 1908, a procession of eunuchs and guardsmen left the Forbidden City to collect him, and the toddler shrieked and fought as they picked him up. His parents said nothing. There was nothing to say. He was bundled into a palanquin and carried off into the dark. The only person from his old life allowed to follow him was his wet nurse. At the coronation in the Hall of Supreme Harmony, the drums and ceremonial music frightened him so badly that he wept through the whole rite while his father held him on the dragon throne and whispered that it would soon be over. His father was right. It would be over soon. Just not in any way that hall could have imagined. Start counting. 1. He was kidnapped into the most powerful job on earth and cried the whole way there. We tend to imagine coronations as glory. This one was closer to an abduction. His parents were not asked, they were told. The boy was theirs in the morning, and the empire's by nightfall. Only one person from his old life was allowed to follow him into the palace, his wet nurse. What makes this stranger than an ordinary royal childhood is what the power did to him. That wet nurse, a woman named Wang Lianshu, was the one adult in his world who treated him like a child instead of a god. And for years, she was the only person who could calm him at all. When he was 8, the dowager consorts had her expelled on the excuse that he was too old to be nursed. He never forgave them. Every day he was instead made to visit a group of former imperial consorts he was told to call his mothers and to report on his progress like a clerk to a board. For years they kept him from even seeing his own mother. Decades later he wrote that, although he had many mothers, he never knew anything like a mother's love. A child raised by everyone, and by no one. It explains more of what follows than anything else about him. We can't climb inside his head, but the pattern is hard to miss. A man who, at the highest and lowest points of his life, never quite learned how to be a person among other people. The throne didn't make him powerful. It made him alone. And the strangest thing about that throne was how quietly it disappeared beneath him. 2. He stopped being emperor, and no one told him. This is the one people refuse to believe. It's true. China's Republican Revolution broke out in October 1911. By February 1912, the Qing was finished. On the 12th, the Empress Dowager Longyu signed the abdication edict on the 6-year-old's behalf, ending the dynasty, and with it, more than 2,000 years of imperial rule in China. A single signature closed an era older than the Roman Empire. The negotiated settlement, the Articles of Favorable Treatment, let the boy keep his title, his servants, and the northern half of the Forbidden City. So, inside those walls, nothing changed. Eunuchs still kowtowed, the drums still beat, he was still addressed as the Son of Heaven, and the Republic outside even promised him a vast yearly stipend to keep up appearances. The stipend, it turned out, was never paid in full. Outside the walls, China was a republic. Inside, a small boy went on being a god. And because his daily routine never broke, it's reasonable to think the change barely registered for a long time. The country he ruled had ceased to exist, but nothing in his day actually said so. He was, in effect, the emperor of a kingdom, the exact size of his own palace. He had not abdicated himself. His regents had done it for him while he played, and no one thought to sit the child down and explain that the throne under him was now a piece of furniture. He grew up in that bubble doing what bored, unsupervised gods do. Which brings us to the kind of god he was. 3. He terrorized a palace of grown men with an air rifle. We picture the boy emperor as a tragic, gentle figure. The records describe something closer to a tiny tyrant. Because no one could refuse him and no one could punish him, Puyi grew cruel the way only an unchecked child can. By his own account, flogging a eunuch had become part of his daily routine by the age of 11, and he fired his airgun at them for sport. As the journalist Edward Baer noted, since the emperor was considered divine, this was simply his right. He could be advised against it, never forbidden. One episode says it all. To reward a eunuch for a good puppet show, the young Puyi ordered a cake baked with iron filings hidden inside it, a gift that would have shattered the man's teeth. Only Wang, his wet nurse, managed to talk him out of it. That was the strange horror of his position. There was almost no command, however cruel, that the palace was allowed to refuse. That is the same boy from item 1, the one who screamed for his parents and never got a mother's love. It's tempting, and probably fair, to read the cruelty and the loneliness as the same wound seen from two sides. A person who has never once been told no has also never once been told he matters for anything but his title. It would be easy to stop and call him a monster. The more interesting question is what happens when, for the first time, somebody hands a boy like this a window to the outside world. Because somebody was about to. 4. He sawed the doorsills out of the Forbidden City so he could ride a bicycle. In 1919, a Scottish scholar named Reginald Johnston was hired to tutor the 13-year-old in English, history, and the modern world. It changed everything. Johnston smuggled the 20th century through the palace gates, one idea at a time. Under his influence, Puyi had a telephone installed, took up the bicycle, and, over the furious objections of the old retainers, finally got the eyeglasses Johnston insisted his nearsighted eyes needed. The court treated the glasses as a scandal, because the sacred eyes of the emperor were not to be corrected by foreign glass. Around 1921, he cut off his queue, the long braided ponytail that marked Qing rule, with his own hands. It horrified the loyalists, and nearly everyone else at court soon copied him. Around the same time, the court decided it was time for him to marry. They handed him photographs of teenage girls to choose from. He later said the faces all looked alike to him, distinguishable only by their clothes, so he simply marked one. Palace factions overruled even that choice. He ended up wed to an empress, Wanrong, and a secondary consort, Wengshu, both married to him in the same wedding in 1922. And on the wedding night, the night an emperor was expected to do his dynastic duty, the teenager took one look at the red bridal chamber, lost his nerve, and fled back to his own room. Both brides slept in the dragon bed alone. One of the most consequential marriages in Chinese history began with the groom running away from it. And then there was the bicycle. He loved it so completely that, by the eunuch's account, he murmured about cycling in his sleep. The trouble was the architecture. Every gateway in the Forbidden City had a high wooden threshold, a doorsill meant to block evil spirits and keep good fortune from leaking out of the house. He had to climb off the bike at each one, so he ordered them cut away. This was not a small thing. In Chinese tradition, severing a threshold damages the fortune of the home, yet many of the sills were taken down to smooth his path. And when the palace later became a museum, the gates of the main passages were rebuilt with removable thresholds that could be slotted back in, so wheeled traffic could pass without permanently altering the design. The architecture of a 500-year-old sacred palace was physically reshaped because the boy who lived in it wanted a smoother bike ride. That was the power he still held inside the walls, even as he held none at all beyond them. But the modern world he was letting in cut both ways. Johnston had also opened his eyes to something the court had spent years hiding from him. He was being robbed blind, and how he answered that is item 5. He fired nearly 1,000 eunuchs in a single stroke, ending an institution thousands of years old. Eunuchs had served Chinese emperors for thousands of years. Puyi abolished them in his palace almost overnight. The eunuchs of the Forbidden City had been quietly looting it for decades, carrying treasures out the gates and selling them in the city's antique shops. Prompted by Johnston, Puyi ordered a full inventory of the storehouses to catch the thieves. And on the night of 26 June, 1923, the Hall of Established Happiness, where the bulk of the Qianlong Emperor's art collection was kept, burned to the ground, almost certainly torched by eunuchs racing to destroy the evidence before the count. Johnston found the young emperor and empress the next morning standing on a heap of charred wood, staring at the ruins. The treasures recorded as lost in that fire are staggering: 2,685 golden statues of the Buddha, 1,675 gold altar ornaments, 435 porcelain antiques, and 31 boxes of sable furs. As the records themselves note, most had likely been stolen and sold long before the first spark. His response was stranger than the theft. Rather than try to police a problem thousands of years old, Puyi simply ended it. In 1923, he expelled the eunuchs from the Forbidden City, well over 1,000 of them, in one sweeping decree. He kept only about 100 after the dowager consorts complained they couldn't function without servants. That morning, 1,000 men, many of them castrated as boys for the promise of a place at court, were turned out of the only world they had ever known, scuffling with police at the palace gates with nowhere to go. Among the last of that vanishing class was a man named Sun Yaoting, remembered as the final surviving eunuch of imperial China, who would live all the way to 1996, long enough to watch the entire civilization that had made him disappear into the history books, an institution older than the dynasty itself, dismantled by a teenager in an afternoon. It is one of the very few decisions in Puyi's life that was genuinely his own, and one of the few that actually worked. Which makes the next thing he did all the more uncomfortable, because while he was punishing the eunuchs for stealing the palace's treasures, he was stealing them too. 6. He smuggled the greatest art collection on Earth out of his own palace, and you can still find the pieces today. This is the part the tragic victim version of his story leaves out entirely. For the years Puyi went on living inside the Forbidden City after his abdication, he treated the imperial art collection, one of the greatest hoards of painting, calligraphy, jade, and bronze ever assembled, as his personal property, quietly moving objects out to sell and to keep. These weren't trinkets. They were thousand-year-old masterpieces, the cultural memory of a civilization. His method was almost domestic in its cunning. He had paintings and calligraphy carried out of the palace disguised as gifts to his younger brother Pujie, then stored in a private house in the foreign concession in Tianjin. When he later went to the Japanese puppet state in the northeast, the treasures traveled with him and filled a building in the city of Changchun. And when that state collapsed in 1945 and he ran for the airfield, the art scattered into the chaos of a falling regime. He carried only about 200 pieces onto the escape plane. The rest was looted by his own guards or sold off into the antique trade. That is why, to this day, some of the most precious paintings in China don't hang in the Forbidden City at all. A large share of the celebrated collection at the Liaoning Provincial Museum, masterworks running from the Eastern Jin through the Tang, Song, Yuan, and Ming, traces its provenance straight back to the artworks Puyi carried out of the palace. The Shenyang Palace Museum and others hold pieces from the same long flight. One man's quiet, years-long looting scattered an empire's art across half a country, and museums spent decades chasing down the fragments. So, when warlords expelled him in 1924, the new government did the one thing nobody expected. It did not loot the remaining collection. It sealed the rooms, sent scholars to inventory every object, and on 10 October 1925, turned the palace into the Palace Museum, handing what had been one family's private treasure to the whole Chinese people. The thief lost the house. The house became everyone's. Almost nothing else he ever reached for ended up belonging to him. He kept trying to take a throne. He kept being handed a stage instead. 7. He let himself be crowned emperor 2 more times, and it got worse each time. Most people know Puyi was emperor once. He was crowned 3 times. The second and third are where the story turns dark. The second was a 12-day fever dream. In the summer of 1917, a loyalist general named Zhang Xun marched his troops into Beijing and put the Qing back on the throne. Puyi was 11. From the 1st to the 12th of July, he was emperor of China again, until the restoration collapsed under nationwide fury. It collapsed with a detail that sounds invented. The Republican premier ordered a French-built Quadron aircraft to fly over the Forbidden City and drop 3 small bombs as a show of force. They did little damage and killed a single eunuch. It is recorded as the first aerial bombardment ever carried out by a Chinese air force. The first bombs a Chinese plane ever dropped fell on the home of the last emperor to chase him off a throne he'd held for 12 days. The third coronation took longer to arrive and cost far more. In 1924, a new warlord, Feng Yuxiang, seized Beijing, tore up the old agreement, stripped Puyi of his title, and gave him roughly 3 hours to leave the Forbidden City. The bubble finally burst. He fled, first to his father's house, then to the Japanese concession in Tianjin, where foreign consuls still called him emperor, still toasted his birthday, and still fed the one hunger that would ruin him: the belief that the throne could be his again. Japan, it turned out, had already taken its first quiet measure of him. After the catastrophic Great Kanto earthquake flattened Tokyo and Yokohama in 1923, Puyi donated jade antiques worth some £33,000 to the relief effort. The grand gesture brought a delegation of Japanese diplomats to thank him in person. In their report, they noted that this young man was highly vain and easily led, exactly the sort of figurehead who could be useful. Historians mark that report as the beginning of Japanese interest in him. They had taken the measure of their puppet years before they reached for the strings. 2 things then hardened his hunger into recklessness. First, his marriages curdled. In 1931, his consort Wen Shu did something no imperial consort in the long history of the Qing had ever done. She sued for, and won, a divorce from an emperor. The humiliation was total, and Puyi took his rage out on the Empress Wanrong, who slid into opium addiction and a slow mental collapse from which she never returned. She would die, alone and abandoned, in a Chinese prison in 1946. The empress of his coronation photographs ended as a forgotten addict in a cell. Second came an insult he could not let go of. In 1928, the warlord Sun Dianying dynamited and looted the tombs of the Qing emperors. He ransacked the mausoleums of the great Qianlong emperor and of Cixi herself, scattered their bones, and stripped the jewels from the corpses. For a man raised on filial piety, the desecration of his ancestors' graves was unforgivable. Puyi never forgave it. From that point, the idea of getting his dynasty back stopped being a daydream and curdled into a vow. So, when Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931 and needed a familiar face to make a puppet state look legitimate, he was ripe for the taking. They installed him in 1932 as chief executive of a new country called Manchukuo, and in 1934 crowned him its emperor under the reign name Kangde. He had wanted to be restored as the great Qing emperor. Instead, he was a borrowed crown on a Japanese stage, and his own brother Pujie was married off to a Japanese aristocrat with ties to the imperial house, so that any heir would carry Tokyo's blood. And being emperor of Manchukuo turned out to mean less than nothing. He was a prisoner in his own palace in Changchun, watched around the clock, unable to leave, or even to choose his own staff without Japanese approval. His private life was administered like state policy. His third consort, Tan Yuling, who had joined him in the late 1930s, died suddenly in 1942. Puyi himself believed she had been killed by the Japanese, and testified as much at the Tokyo trial. He kept a lock of her hair for the rest of his life. The next year, the Japanese simply handed him a replacement, Li Yuqin, a 15-year-old schoolgirl they selected to be his consort. He had chosen her no more than he had chosen the throne. Looked at whole, the pattern of his life is hard to miss. Every crown he wore and every wife he married had been chosen for him, then handed over as an honor. One detail captures the whole humiliating arrangement. Japanese propaganda had sold him to the world as a Renaissance prince, a great reader, a calligrapher, a painter, and above all, a magnificent horseman who could loose arrows from the saddle like his Manchu ancestors. Taking the propaganda at face value, the Japanese presented him with a fine horse so he could review the troops from the saddle. There was a problem. Puyi was not a horseman. He was in fact terrified of horses, and he flatly refused to mount the animal. There is one small, strange grace note from these years. His old tutor, Reginald Johnston, had retired to a tiny island off the coast of Scotland. Puyi gave him permission to fly the flag of Manchukuo over it, which made that windswept rock the only place outside East Asia where the puppet emperor's banner ever flew. An empire of one island, for the friend who had once smuggled him a bicycle. A man sold to the world as a warrior king, who wouldn't get on the gift horse, whose flag flew freely only on a Scottish island he would never see. That gap, between the emperor he was supposed to be and the frightened man he actually was, is the truest portrait of him there is. And it was about to be cracked open in front of the entire world. 8. He was the worst witness a war crimes trial ever saw, and later admitted he'd lied. When Japan surrendered in 1945, Puyi tried to flee toward Japan and was captured at the airfield by the Soviet Red Army. What happened next, almost nobody pictures correctly. He was not thrown in a cell. He spent the next 5 years in the Soviet Union as a kind of pampered prisoner, kept in sanatoriums and guarded quarters, given his own rooms, served meals apart from ordinary captives, and excused from any labor. He had arrived with servants and a stash of jewels, and for a while he lived less like a war criminal than like a deposed monarch on a strange, indefinite holiday. He was held in the Soviet Far East, and the longer his stay ran on, the more openly he hoped it would simply never end. And he did everything in his power to stay there. He begged Stalin in writing, more than once, not to send him home to China, certain he would be executed the moment he crossed the border. He wrote that he had been reading Marx and Lenin and had changed his whole view of the world and hoped to make himself useful enough to keep. None of it worked. In 1950, wanting to warm relations with the new government of Mao Zedong, Stalin handed him back to China anyway. It was the one outcome the former emperor had spent 5 years trying to avoid. In 1946, in the middle of that captivity, the Soviets brought him to Tokyo to testify at the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, the war crimes trial of Japan's wartime leadership. He was on the stand for 8 days, By the reckoning of historians who have studied the proceedings, that was a longer stretch than any other witness gave at the Tokyo trial, and by every account, it was a disaster. His goal was simple and desperate, to prove he had been a helpless puppet, guilty of nothing. So he raged, dodged, performed, and contradicted himself. When prosecutors pressed him on basic dates, he snapped that they should stop asking him about dates. He described being summoned to Tokyo, feted, and handed sacred regalia he was meant to use to impose a foreign religion on Manchuria. He called it among the deepest humiliations of his life. He had every reason to expect a death sentence. A man who had sheltered under Japanese protection and then served for over a decade as Japan's hand-picked emperor in occupied China was an obvious candidate for the gallows. And the nationalists, who executed collaborators, were openly demanding his extradition. Begging the Soviets to keep him probably saved his life. They refused every request to hand him to the people who most wanted him dead, and delivered him instead to a government that, as it turned out, had decided he was worth more reformed than executed. The same government would later try 45 Japanese war criminals at Shenyang, and, under a deliberate policy of leniency, execute not a single one. Esme. The performance convinced almost no one. Observers felt he would say anything to save his own skin, and years later, in his own memoir, Puyi all but admitted it. He had shaped his testimony to protect himself, heaping the blame onto the Japanese, when, in private, he could describe himself as a wire carrying the Kwantung Army's current. This is where historians genuinely split, and where this video stops pretending to know. Was Puyi a victim? A weak man dragged through history by forces vastly larger than himself, never once the author of his own life? Or was he a willing collaborator who chose Manchukuo because he wanted his throne so badly he would take it from anyone holding one out? The records don't settle it. Even the museum built in his former palace calls him both traitor and victim of circumstance. They show a man who was both used and hungry, and they leave you to weigh the two. The strangest turn in the whole story is that, eventually, he decided for himself. He chose victim, then guilt, and as far as anyone could tell, he meant it. 9. He walked out of a re-education camp unable to tie his own shoes, and grateful for it. The Soviets handed Puyi back to the new People's Republic of China in 1950. He was sent to the Fushun War Criminals Management Center and spent nearly 10 years there in the communist program of re-education reserved for political prisoners. The program was not only about shoelaces. The prisoners were made to study, to write out long confessions, and, hardest of all, to confront what had actually been done in the territory Puyi had nominally ruled. He was shown the evidence of Japanese atrocities in Manchuria, the medical experiments and massacres carried out in the name of the state whose throne he had occupied, and pressed to account for his own part in lending it legitimacy. It is here that the man who had spent 8 days in Tokyo, blaming everyone but himself, slowly began, at least on paper, to do the opposite. What happened to him in that decade is the hinge of his entire life. For the first time, at over 40 years old, he had to learn things every other adult already knew. He had never dressed himself, never tied his shoes properly, never bought anything, traveled alone, or done a day of physical labor. He had been waited on, hand and foot, since before he could walk. The stories from Fushun are oddly tender. Fellow prisoners, some of them officials who had once served under him, ended up teaching the former son of heaven how to thread a needle and knot a shoelace. He mended his own clothes, badly, and slowly, clumsily, he became a person who could survive without an army of servants. For the first time in his life, the people around him were neither kneeling nor pulling strings. They were just people, and he had to learn to be one of them. Everyone who knew him afterward describes a man who came out genuinely transformed and genuinely helpless. He forgot to flush toilets. He left doors open and water running. He was hopeless with directions. The lost man from the very start of this video, the one telling strangers on the street that he used to be emperor, is this man, freshly released, unable to find his way around the city he had once, on paper, ruled. In 1959, he was among the first prisoners, granted a special pardon. And whether you find it moving or unsettling, what he said about that decade was that he had experienced something like a rebirth, that he finally understood how thoroughly his old life had been soaked in cruelty. He praised the new China at press conferences as sincerely as anyone could judge. We should be honest that the memoir recording all this was produced under government pressure and edited to fit a political story. So it's fair to assume his self-condemnation is part genuine and part coerced. The two are hard to pull apart, and probably were for him too. But the people around him in those last years describe a man who truly seemed to believe he deserved to have lost everything. Most stories about fallen kings end in bitterness. His ended in something far harder to believe: gratitude. And the final chapter is the one that sounds most like fiction of all. 10. He bought a ticket to visit his own home and treasured a slip of paper more than the throne. In 1960, the last emperor of China got a job tending plants at the Beijing Botanical Garden. A man who had once owned an empire now tended a single bed of flowers, clocked in, and drew a modest wage. The details of his ordinary life are almost unbearably gentle. When he went to visit the Forbidden City, he bought a ticket to enter the house where he had been worshipped as a god, then wandered the halls pointing out the rooms where he had lived and the things he had played with as a child. A tour guide to his own lost world, holding the same ticket as the tourists beside him. In 1962, at 56, he married a hospital nurse named Li Shuxian. No imperial decree, no dynastic alliance. A friend introduced them, the way anyone else might meet a spouse. By the accounts of those around them, it was the first happy, ordinary relationship of his life. He walked her to the bus in the mornings and waited for her after late shifts. As the story is told, one rainy night he noticed an open sewer grate on her route home and stood guard over it so she wouldn't fall in. Whether or not every detail is exact, it is the kind of small, attentive devotion everyone who knew him in these years describes. The most powerful man ever born in China, guarding a drain in the rain for the woman he loved. And he voted. As a citizen of the People's Republic, the man who had once been the state cast a single ballot like anyone else, and he is said to have treasured the documents that proved he was, at last, just one citizen among hundreds of millions. To a man who had been handed everything and allowed to choose nothing, an ordinary voter's slip could plausibly mean more than any throne he had ever sat on. There is one last role most people never hear about, and it is quietly perfect. In 1964, the gardener was given a desk job. He became a researcher and editor at a state institute of culture and history, working under the body that gathers advisors from outside the Communist Party. His task was to help document the history of the late Qing court, the very world he had been born to rule. The last emperor of China spent his final working years writing up the customs and ceremonies of the imperial palace for the historical record. He turned his own vanished kingdom into research notes for the republic that had replaced it. The Son of Heaven ended his career as a man, filing paperwork about the Son of Heaven. He had been the subject of the empire, then its prisoner, then its symbol of disgrace, and finally one of its archivists. Treated by his colleagues as an unfailingly polite and rather absent-minded older gentleman who happened to know more about the Forbidden City than anyone alive. He didn't get to keep the quiet for long. The Cultural Revolution erupted in 1966, and a former emperor was an obvious target. Red Guards ransacked homes for any trace of the old, feudal China, and threatening letters began to arrive. By some accounts, he grew so frightened that he checked himself into a hospital. Premier Zhou Enlai personally ordered him protected, but Puyi was already dying. On 17 October 1967, he died of kidney cancer, 61 years old, as the country convulsed around him. In the mid-1990s, his widow had his ashes moved to a cemetery near the western Qing tombs, within reach of 4 of the very emperors who had reigned before him. So the last emperor of China rests beside his ancestors after all, not as their heir, as a private citizen who bought his way back in. Go back to that street, the lost man in the cotton jacket, telling strangers he used to be emperor of China, and being waved off because the claim was simply too absurd to believe. Nobody believed him because his real life was stranger than the title ever was. He was handed the most worshipped position on earth before he could talk, and then spent 50 years having it taken from him in pieces, until the only thing left to own was a ticket back into his own house. He spent the first half of his life unable to choose anything. He spent the second half discovering that choosing a job, a wife, a vote was the only power that had ever been worth having. Historians still cannot agree what to make of him, a victim of forces vastly larger than himself, or a willing collaborator who kept reaching for a crown until it nearly cost him his neck. The evidence cuts both ways, and serious people land in different places. After everything you've just heard, where do you put him? If stories like this are why you're here, the subscribe button keeps them coming.